I mean, you see this even in the history of Christianity. Christianity starts off a very charismatic and ecstatic tradition. I mean, the day of Pentecost is people speaking in tongues. Paul is always writing about the gift of tongues, the gift of prophecy, the gift of healing. But then over the first century, you have a turn against charisma. You have the centralizing of religious authority in the bishop. But then you even have in the second century AD new upstarts. You have this movement called Montanism, which is a charismatic kind of shamanic religion where you have trance prophets and you have competition then between the bishops and the new church and the Montanists. It's something that Christianity has experienced throughout its history from the beginning. I mean, Shakers and
Yeah,
Quakers are
right,
defined
right. Just
on
the
the
split
basis
between,
of being
yeah.
ecstatic,
I
being
mean, the split
shaking and
between
being quaking.
Catholicism and Protestantism seems to fit here, right? The Protestants were the people that didn't want all the authority concentrated in, the popes and the bishops, and they wanted to talk directly to God and read the Bible directly. So you do see this basically everywhere you look, this type of tension.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
What about very, very early Christianity? Jesus himself, the basis for Christianity. Was Jesus a shamanic character in some ways?
Yeah. So this is something I talk about a bunch in the book. And
I did not get to that part, but
yeah, so in short, maybe without um, spoiling too much, I argue that there are many reasons that we should suspect not only that Jesus was a roughly shamanic character, but that he was probably quite literally a shaman.
hmm,
Um, the most difficult thing I'll admit, and I'm not the first person to put forward this claim. There are a number of scholars who have argued that Jesus was probably possessed and potentially entered these altered states. I would say the hardest thing to demonstrate using the Gospels, for example, is that he entered kind of ecstatic, altered states. And so in the book, I go through some evidence for why it's at least reasonable to suspect that.
can you give us a
But
basic sense for that? Why might you suspect that?
Okay, so I think there are a number of reasons. One is that the Eastern Mediterranean, we knew that the Eastern Mediterranean was a very shamanic place. The
Hmm.
Hebrew prophets, um, I think there's good reason to conclude that the Hebrew prophets were a good number of them were shamans. We know that the Greco-Roman world had shamans. I mean, the oracle at Delphi was
Hmm.
very clearly a shaman, someone who's possessed, and in possession is engaging with probably Apollo and then divining. I mean, that's a clear shaman. So we know the Greco-Roman world was shamanic. We knew that the Israelites probably were shamanic. We know that Mesopotamia had these prophet figures who divined in altered states, probably very
Hmm.
shamanic.
Hmm. I
So
suppose
just
I
at its
suppose even
basic,
oh, I
yeah.
suppose even in the absence of direct evidence that Jesus would have directly entered into non-ordinary states. Whether or not that's true, this is certainly a case where you're talking about a charismatic individual talking directly with all of the people outside of the confines of the formal power structure that was kind of ruling that society at the time.
Yeah, without even getting into the evidence, I think exactly we have a place that was very clearly shamanic,
Hmm.
or a general cultural region. Um, and we have an individual who's defined by healing and divination and engagement with non-ordinary realities. He's channeling or engaging with the Holy Spirit. He's removing demons, and he's doing that for healing, and he's very often divining. So just on the basis of, if we're anthropologists, and we're just going on the basis of basic inference, I think the starting hypothesis is not that, oh, he's exceptional and peculiar in this way, but that as you would have for most prophet healers in this particular part of the world at this particular time, we would expect them to be shamanic. Um, then there are passages in the Gospels that we can look at, and I analyze a couple following other scholars. Other scholars have analyzed the Gospels and looked for this evidence. I mean, the Gospels are very tricky. They're already coming out at a time past the early Christian church. We would have probably already expected there to be a turn against trance. But nevertheless, there are interesting indications, even in there, where, he's called to heal, um, while healing, is accused of being possessed. A flock of people goes to him. His family and intimates are holding him. Um, again, these are passages that other scholars have taken as evidence potentially of spirit possession in the context of healing. I'm just following them. And so this is essentially the approach. It's to go on the basis both of textual evidence, but also just the general ethnography of that time and place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I guess, one takeaway here is that it's problematic to think of shamanic religions and non-shamanic religions, because when you look at the history of any given religious tradition, different facets of it, different sub disciplines within it would have had a more shamanic expression and others not. It's this sort of living, moving, dynamic thing. It's not Christianity and then shamanism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I taught a class on shamanism last quarter, and I was just looking at materials online, and I found this phylogeny of of world religions, and
Mm-hmm.
so many of the phylogeny of world religions had modern world religions starting in some kind of Pleistocene or archaic time with shamanism. Whereas the alternative is exactly what you're saying. I think that shamanism is an element of religion that you find just manifesting being oppressed. Um, yeah.
And it's yeah, so there's it's this moving thing. It's one way that any given religion could potentially be expressed, as opposed to other ways it could be expressed. You talked in the book about you had a line in the beginning where you said you've chased modern resurrections of shamanism from Harvard Square to the Nevada deserts. What are you referring to there? Where do we see in today's technological, modern, nominally secular world in many ways? Where do we see these modern resurrections of shamanism?
So the two that I'm talking about over there are both very explicitly neo-shamans. So or strands of neo-shamanism. And these are people who very often identify themselves as shamans. So in Harvard Square, there's the Cambridge Shamanic Circle, so I did my PhD at Harvard, and a short bike ride from campus is the Quaker House. And potentially still now, at least when I was doing my PhD, they would have a shamanic circle. The Nevada desert is a reference to Burning Man. And so in the book, I talk about Shaman Dome at Burning Man. And Shaman Dome actually traces its you might say, shamanic lineage to the same figures and movement that the Cambridge Shamanic Circle and much of neo-shamanism does today, which is something called core shamanism. It was developed by the anthropologist turned neo-shamanic guru Michael Harner. And so there's a lot of debate over is neo-shamanism should we treat that as shamanism? Is it fair to call it shamanism, or is it some kind of corruption or um,
Mm-hmm.
mockery of shamanism?
Yeah,
And so something in the book I try to figure out is by going into these spaces and analyzing them and trying to understand, are they shamanic?
yeah. So you had to go to Burning Man for work.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.